We're moving in a new direction, moving forward, and moving beyond smoking. We are Altria, and our companies are leading the way in moving adult smokers away from cigarettes by taking action to transition millions toward potentially less harmful choices as we move from being known as a tobacco company to being recognized as a tobacco harm reduction company. Altria is moving beyond smoking. Find out how at altria.com.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like Grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Almo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Almo's World Podcast. This is Elmo Odor Jr. Thank you so much, Jonathan Baker, for being here with us today. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, you can call me John. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher in China. I received my Ph.D. in geology with a focus on paleoclimate reconstruction. So I'm most interested in studying how climates have changed over the past, especially in northern Eurasia. So that's most of my work is in Russia.
Cool. So when you talk about paleoclimatology, right? It's more focused on studying the science of how climate is, what affects it, and the global impact we have over it.
Correct. And I mean, our focus is to study how climate, first of all, document how climate has changed in the past. And we could do that on a local scale. Like if we just want to go to a specific part of the world and we want to know, 5,000 years ago, how different it was and how it's changed over time, maybe there are specific patterns to that change. Most importantly, we want to understand why climate has changed and what the influencing factors were. Its relevance to the modern situation is if we can understand how it changes naturally, then we can delineate, human influences today, and we can use this understanding to project into the future, what's in store for us and how that may impact ecologies and societies and so forth.
What are usually the enemies of your science? Like, is it more on those who don't believe in climate change, the corrupt oil companies, and what sort of people wish to obstruct the goals of your studies?
That's quite the loaded question. So let me break it down a little bit. First of all, when it comes to paleoclimate, the interest in this it dates back to at least to the 1800s. Arguably before that, but in terms of a rigorous science, it goes back to the 1800s, especially an interest in identifying this past ice age, or this hypothetical ice age that Louis Agassiz and several others found evidence of. They found evidence that there was ice forming in the Alps that's no longer there, in other parts of Europe. And eventually that turned into, recognizing that, at some point in Earth history, the overall weather and climate was very different from what we experience today. And there must be, some mechanism behind that. It took a lot of work, but eventually we identified some of the main mechanisms, especially studying atmospheric chemistry and, incoming radiation from the sun and outgoing radiation into space. Looking at the physics behind this, and then finally getting into the geological evidence. In the mid-20th century, it's when we started to dig up evidence, through ice cores and drilling down through ocean sediments at a much accelerated rate. So we had these huge data sets coming in that showed that climate changed very rhythmically. There was a pattern to it going up and down, and we were able eventually to explain, or mostly explain, this pattern of ice ages and warm periods in between, and also go back much farther than that, not just our recent climate change over the past few million years, but going back to the Mesozoic, to the Paleozoic, and to the very beginnings of Earth history. So a lot of this, though, we learned through oil exploration, at least some of these large data sets. And the reason for that is if you want to find oil, you have to be able to identify in the rock record what kind of environments existed there, and you want to be able to predict, where to find similar environments, because if you have an environment that would trap organic matter that would turn into hydrocarbons that could be exploited for oil and gas, then you need to understand like this pattern of environmental change and also climatic change. So it's oil exploration that led to a lot of our initial understandings on on detailed climate change. So you talked about before we go into objecting opinions and things like that, I think it's important to clarify first what we're talking about. I'm using this term climate change, and we could throw in the term global warming. These are not exactly the same thing, but as we use them colloquially and just in common speech, they refer to the same kind of phenomenon. So if I'm using that term global warming or climate change, generally it refers to this abrupt increase in surface temperatures, especially since the 1950s to the modern day, and that's the abrupt increase in temperatures that's linked specifically to human activities. So of course we can use climate change and global warming as a general term. We could talk about it happening 50 million years ago or a billion years ago. But when we use those terms without caveat, then generally that's what it's referring to. Is this very recent trend over the last few decades. But I said these terms are not exactly the same thing. So global warming or global cooling refers to a net persistent change in the planetary heat balance. Planetary heat balance meaning we have radiation coming in from the sun, warming the surface of the Earth. We have radiation lost to space, right? And it works just like a budget. And if you understand a budget, then you can understand the basic physics of this. Heat coming in, heat going out. If those amounts are the same, then there's no change in heat in Earth's surface systems over time. But if there's more heat coming in, then it will lead to an increase in heat, right? So when we say global warming, we're specifically referring to a long-term change in that heat balance, or a heat imbalance that leads to a long-term change in the total heat content in Earth's surface systems, right? So the surface systems, that includes the
But can you give me, like, in terms of how you've taken the data you've taken about the current situation we have on climate change or global warming, in terms of like a nuclear doomsday clock, like how much time do we have on Earth to like go back and change the course of history, and that we don't, or that we're not at a point of no return or something?
There's no single answer to that, and it can be quite subjective, depending on where you live and what your local vulnerabilities are. I mean, for some communities today, like that time has already passed and that threat is already there. Others are much more buffered from the impacts, and humans as a species are much more buffered from the impacts than many other species, right? We're a lot more adaptable than something like coral that's just stuck there in the ocean, right? And it is much more vulnerable to shifts in temperature and ocean pH and things like that. So I hesitate to put any single number, and you should be, if anybody does give you a simple number like that, you should first try and figure out exactly what they mean. Usually, if we talk about having so many years to reverse the course or mitigate climate change, then usually it's referring to a point at which it's going to be much more difficult, or at which humans can no longer feasibly impact the course of climatic change due to feedbacks in the system. And feedbacks would be like, well, if it gets to the point where the polar ice caps start melting at a certain rate, then it doesn't really matter if we cut off every power plant, every car, and every other source of greenhouse gas emissions. Like at that point, the feedbacks from the melting will cause it to continue to warm regardless of what we do. So that's the biggest concern. And like I said, there's no single number that anyone can place on that. We can certainly put estimates and make projections, and it's important to distinguish between projections and predictions. Right? And I think these terms are thrown around a little bit too loosely. I mean, making a prediction is more like predicting who's going to win some championship game, or the World Cup or something like that. But it's a projection assumes certain behaviors and certain behaviors of physical variables and human behaviors along the path. So we can project, like, if we do X, then change in the future would be, it would be this plus or minus this, and so it assumes that certain things will happen, and that's why there's a range of uncertainty and so forth. So to give you an idea, like we can project, for example, that surface temperatures will increase by another 1 degree Celsius over so many years. But that projection will have certain assumptions built into it. For example, what our greenhouse gas outputs will be. It assumes that we can constrain, like, outputs from solar activity or feedbacks from ice and things like that. So projections always come with uncertainties, and that's why there is no specific number. Nonetheless, I mean, it's evident that already we've gotten to a certain point where there's enough excess heat locked into the system, especially into the oceans, that it's becoming less and less feasible to mitigate impacts to a certain point. I mean, there is no real doomsday scenario here where everything and everyone on the planet is dead and can't survive. But so that's why I avoid conversations that use this very subjective language. Like end of the world. I mean, that's a very subjective term. I mean, end of the world means different things to everyone. So it's not scientifically relevant. Same with something like doomsday or dystopia or anything else. So it's important to restrict the conversation to very quantitative terms if we can. And that's the best we can do. I mean, we can project, for example, that Arctic sea ice coverage will be less than 15% by the 2040s, plus or minus a decade or so. That's a general projection.
Yeah, but I guess that I wanted to shape my question on whether or not we should worry about things, because if there's still something we can do about it, about what could happen in the future, and we still have the chance, and like in the media and education, there's always an emphasis on how, or on the man's impact on climate change, global warming, especially. So I wanted to ask, like, should we worry about climate change? Because a lot of people, like, for example, I've listened to Candace Owens talk to Joe Rogan about this, and she said that she's not gonna be worried about climate change because in a way, like, climate change always happen and it will happen. So she'd rather not think about it because it's inevitable or something. But I guess that's pretty stupid in my opinion.
There are a series of logical flaws there, but let me highlight again that whether or not we should worry about it, again, is a subjective term, or it's a personal decision. I would break it down this way. So let's take a step back. I think so. Climate change it should not be controversial, but understandably it is, because the claim is that there's an abrupt increase in surface temperatures, an abrupt change in climatic variables that we attribute to human activity over the past hundreds of years, actually. And if that is the case, and if that will lead to detrimental consequences, not just for human societies and economies, but also for ecologies, extinction of species and things like that. If that is the case, then we're faced with the question whether we ought to do something, can we do something, and what can we do exactly, right? So we break it down this way. First, there's a scientific question, and that is a simple observation whether or not this is happening. And this is totally separate from the question of whether we should care or do something about it. I mean, we could come to the conclusion that yes, global warming is happening, it's getting worse, and it's going to have all these negative impacts, but I don't care because I just don't care. Personally, I have no moral investment in that, so I just choose not to worry about it. I mean, somebody could come to that conclusion because, again, these are unrelated, right? So the first is a scientific question. The second is a moral question, right? If that is the case, ought we act, right? And we could establish scientifically that some factory is polluting the farmland around it, right? And that pollution is causing people to get sick and animals to die and things like that. But the moral question is still there, whether we ought to do something about that. I mean, maybe the factory owner decides that if it's not his life at stake, then it's not worth worrying about. And I think that's what a lot of people end up doing. I mean, I use an example that's it's a lot more obvious. But for most people, they don't see it as directly relevant to themselves, and they find a way to distance themselves from the moral question, and therefore they don't even consider the last section, which is a political question. The political question is, what can we do about it? What's the best way to address this, right? I mean, so we can agree, for example, scientifically that yes, this is happening. We can agree morally that we ought to do something about it, and we can disagree wildly about what to do about it. And that should be the order of reasoning. Like we should go first from the scientific observations and all of those reports, and then move to the moral question, and then move to the political question. But I think what happens, especially with somebody like the example you mentioned, what happens with a lot of people is they look first at the proposed political solutions. They say, I don't like that. And one way to avoid that conversation is to pretend that the moral or the scientific questions are flawed, right? So they work through it backwards. They say, I don't like what you're telling me I need to do to fix climate change, whatever that means. So I'm going to go back to being skeptical. It's kind of a defense mechanism, actually. They go to being skeptical about the science itself. And it's extremely effective, but
when you talk about the moral decision and being skeptical about it, but others, like for example, a lot of religious people who believe that the Earth will eventually be destroyed, like they accept climate change and global warming, and they know it's happening, but they because they believe that God is gonna destroy this old Earth and He's gonna make a new Earth, and so they just don't care about what their effect on this their global impact on climate change is, because they see it as part of like this narrative of apocalypse. But so
well,
yeah.
I mean, that's just an example of how people can diverge in opinion on the moral question. And you gave an example of where somebody believes that that there's some external providence over natural world, and there's some direction in which it's heading, and therefore, we may acknowledge that climate change is happening, but we're not so worried about it because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, somebody can come to the same conclusion from a more nihilist or atheistic perspective, saying, well, if it's not going to affect me before I die, I just don't care personally. And most people within that paradigm do not come to that conclusion, but they could try and make their case, right? So again, it doesn't necessarily matter where you're coming from. Whatever philosophical or religious paradigm you're in, that works as a filter to decide whether I should care about it. So when you're asking me, for example, whether we should worry about climate change, that depends on you and what you worry about and why you worry about it. I mean, if you don't care for the lives of others, then no, you shouldn't worry about climate change, probably. I mean, but if you do care about the lives of others and the well-being of others, and if you care about your your bank account, if you care about the taxes you pay, if you care about immigration, if you care about a lot of other things, then you should worry about it because it's going to impact, and it has impacted all of these things, right? I mean, overall, climate-related disasters are a drain on the economy, every economy, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars a year in the Western world, at least. I mean, we see that right now. We've seen that through this season and almost every season in the last 20 years. So it is a drain on the economy. It does impact how much of your money, either directly or indirectly, goes to addressing the consequences, right? It also impacts the stability of societies, right? So some societies are more buffered from that. I mean, the middle of the United States is certainly more buffered from the impacts of climate change. I mean, arguably there are impacts there, but they're going to be more buffered than, say, coastal societies in Southeast Asia, which are more densely populated. They're more susceptible to extreme weather events and to sea level rise and things like that. So as these impacts accumulate, though, it destabilizes societies around the world. Not at the same rate, but it destabilizes societies to the point that causes migration, right? And everyone will have a different opinion on immigration and political borders and so forth. But the fact is, you have to deal with that question more and more as the impacts of climate change accumulate, right? So there are a lot of people, for example, in the United States. I mean, it's a sharply divisive political issue. But for people that are very anti-immigration, they also tend to be ones that don't care about climate change. So when climate-related disasters destabilize a region that causes mass migration, millions of people or thousands of people looking for another place to live, a place to find refuge for their families, and they try to come here, then these are the same people that say, I don't care about climate change, but I also don't want those people on my doorstep. Let's kick them out. And you can't have it both ways. I mean, you can't not care about climate change and then try to dismiss the direct impacts of it. So it becomes an unspoken political dilemma here, and again in many other places.
Okay. So I agree with you that there are different moral paradigms that is very, very subjective to every individual, I guess. But in terms of having different paradigms, I think it's essential to have at least an objective scientific understanding of the current state of the climate change on Earth and global warming, in order for those with different moral paradigms to make decisions about this, or what the actions they should take, right? So because you yourself, you're a scientist, in your understanding, should it's not that should, but is there a need for us to do something about how we interact with nature and all that stuff?
If you ask me, yes. I think there's no question. And where people are divided on this question, I mean, I mentioned the importance of those moral paradigms, but usually that's not the point of disagreement. And again, I don't mean to be American-centric here, but just because those are the data I'm familiar with, let me give an example. At least in the U.S., religious affiliation is not the strongest predictor of whether somebody is skeptical of climate change. It's either their political affiliation or their level of scientific comprehension, right? So those are the two major indicators. Like if you just picked a person at random and all you knew is their highest level of education and their political affiliation, you can strongly predict what their attitude on climate change will be. That's different from if you just knew, what their religious affiliation was. So in the U.S., for example, the demographic that is most accepting of the scientific view on this is Hispanic Catholics, and behind them are atheists and Black Protestants. But the demographics that are most skeptical about climate change are white Catholics and white Protestants. right? So you see it all over the map in terms of religious affiliation, and the strongest predictor again is where they tend to align politically. So it goes back to what I'm saying is that what I said earlier, that most people argue this backwards. They look at what people are saying in the media, what politicians are saying about what we ought to do, and then they pick and choose. Well, I don't like that idea. I would prefer this idea, and that sort of decides in advance how I should address, how I should approach the scientific data, whether I should be accepting of it or trusting of scientists or so forth. So what's happened here, I mean, there didn't used to be this sort of political divide. If you go back, let me think here. If you go back at least 15 years prior to Obama's election, if you took a random selection of Democrats and Republicans, they would have very similar attitudes on global warming. But since that time, it's become very sharply divided, right? Where Republicans are decidedly more skeptical and Democrats are decidedly more accepting of the scientific view.
What are the most obvious data to show what the need is scientifically rather than morally?
Good question. Where to start? So first of all, I mean, I mentioned earlier I wanted to distinguish between global warming and climate change briefly. One of the silliest and most persistent few ideas that I've heard and keep hearing is that these terms are kind of thrown around depending on which one sounds more acceptable to people. And there's this idea that scientists use the term global warming until they thought it was not persuasive, and then they switched to climate change and so forth. The reason I wanted to define that clearly is to show what they refer to both. In fact, even going back to the 1950s, there are papers that describe the phenomenon of climate change and theories of climate change. The idea that one term was switched to the other is just patently absurd. So we talk about global warming again. We're referring to the planetary heat imbalance, but heat is not the same thing as temperature, right? I mean, you can add heat to a glass of ice water without raising the temperature, right? And so the expression of that excess heat could be melting of ice or the evaporation of water, something like that. So air temperature is one variable. And when we talk about climate change, we're referring specifically to a persistent change or a shift in the mean or median or statistical distribution of climate variables, of which temperature is one, right? So a change in the 30-year average of surface temperature, a change in the 30-year average of rainfall or snowfall or evaporation, humidity, wind direction, wind speed, air pressure, and things like that. So I mean, this is the difference, and that's why we can talk about we can use those terms, global warming and climate change, to refer to those specific phenomenon. The most obvious data set, therefore, are changes in surface temperature, changes in heat content, and changes in ice volume. Right, so all of these are impacted by global warming, changes in the planetary heat balance. So surface temperature is one. Since the 1950s, and there's been about a 1 degree Celsius change in global surface temperature. So that's averaging the entire surface temperature of the Earth, the surface air temperature. Right, and 1 degree Celsius doesn't seem like a lot. It's not something that you could sense personally. So I always say, put that in context. Travel back in time about 21,000 years ago, right? So 21,000 years ago is the peak of the last ice age. This is a time when pretty much the entire country of Canada, parts of the northern U.S., the entirety of Scandinavia, parts of Central Europe, and northwestern Russia were all covered in a mile-thick sheet of ice, right? So it's a very different world climatically. Sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. But that huge change between 21,000 years ago and let's go back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, so that's about the year 1850, 1870. From 21,000 years ago to the end of the 19th century, there's about a 4 degree Celsius change in global surface temperature. Right? It took 21,000 years to raise the global temperature by 4 degrees Celsius. And we've observed a 1 degree Celsius change since the 1950s to 1970s. Right, so that's in the span of 50 to 70 years. The rate of modern warming is substantially greater than is observed through natural climate change, through natural deglaciation, or this transition from the ice age to the interglacial. Does that make sense?
Like volcanoes, because like they blow so much smoke and stuff, and a lot of people like argue that volcanoes give more pollution than a lot of factories or power plants combined. I don't know, is that true, or is it like...
No, I wouldn't. That's not really an argument. It tends to be a diversion tactic. I mean, you can throw that out there because it's something that may sound plausible if you have no idea what the numbers look like. But volcanic activity is well monitored. We know what kind of gas outputs come from global volcanic activity, including at the ocean floor. And the sum volcanic activity for the whole year amounts to just, so I'm trying to remember here off the top of my head, just a couple days of human outputs. Right, so it takes a few days to produce what all the world's volcanoes do throughout the entire year. But even if that weren't the case, the amount of greenhouse gas outputs from volcanic activity doesn't really change from one year to the next. It barely changes from one century or one millennium to the next. Right, so it's fairly constant over time. Whereas, say, greenhouse gas outputs from factories and automobiles and agriculture and things like this, they certainly changed substantially over the last century. And it's nowhere close, 1,000 years ago compared to today. Right, so this is something that does change on very short time scales. Right, whereas volcanic activity is very stable. Same with solar outputs. I mean, solar output, energy coming from the sun to the Earth, does change over time, but it's very, very small changes and quite negligible on surface climates. This was a surprise. I mean, for a long time we thought this would be one of the main drivers, and for a long time it was argued that this was the main driver of what's referred to as the Little Ice Age. A period from the 1400s to the 1800s that was relatively cold in most places, especially Europe. But the more and more we research that, the more we find that this Little Ice Age anomaly it doesn't occur at the same time everywhere on Earth. It's not always a cooling trend, and sometimes it's expressed just by changes in precipitation, rainfall patterns, and therefore we find that solar variability is not a very strong driver of the Little Ice Age even, which was kind of a classic example of how changes in the sun could affect surface climate. So solar variability on short time scales, even on longer time scales, doesn't have nearly the same potential impact as the short-term changes in the atmospheric composition. Right. So as we study natural climate change, especially the timeline that I have focused most of my work on is the last 12,000 years. And if we're looking at the last 12,000 years, there are episodes of abrupt climate change for sure, where there's a sudden shift in temperatures in one part of the world or the other. The net global change it usually isn't that substantial, but most of these climatic changes are related to shifts in like ocean circulation or extreme melting of glaciers that also impacts ocean circulation. Because the atmospheric circulation, ocean circulation, this modulates how heat is moved around the planet. Right? It has less of an impact on the total heat budget for the planet, but it does impact how it's moved around the planet. So most people are familiar with like the El Nino phenomenon, the El Nino-La Nina cycle. And if you're if you're in the Western Pacific, which you are, right, or in the Eastern Pacific, you're especially familiar with this because it could make some years, miserably hot or miserably dry or the opposite, right? So this phenomenon, it shifts heat around the globe, and specifically it moves heat from the oceans to the atmosphere and from the atmosphere back to the oceans. So things like this, if you're only studying one region, it can appear like it can appear like there are big climatic changes if you focused on one location, but when you put the whole portrait together, things tend to balance out more and are more strongly influenced by how heat has moved around the planet. So it's been a it's been a widely researched field, trying to extend this global temperature record back as far as we can. But the more data that we have, the more we look at it, the more obvious it is that the modern climate scenario is very anomalous. It certainly it doesn't fit in with. I mean, you can't look back and find appropriate analogies, both because of the abrupt shift in temperatures, not just at any one part of the Earth, but looking at the entire globe. Also, the abrupt change in ice volume. I mean, we see losses in polar ice sheets, and we see sea level change happening at rates that are not normal outside of a deglacial period. A deglacial period is when you're transitioning from a full ice age to the interglacial warm period that we experience, that human civilization grew up in. But the thing is, we're not in a deglacial period right now, and that happened a long time ago. It's been over for at least 6,000 years. So the fact that we are seeing, ice loss and sea level rise at the rates that normally would be observed only during deglaciation, that alone should tell us that this is highly anomalous and something that if we can act on, then we ought to act on if there are negative consequences, right? This is what's most worrisome from a scientific perspective, that the modern scenario is highly anomalous. So going back to your, you mentioned this Candace Owen going on Joe Rogan and saying that it's always changed before, it's inevitable. This is extremely naive, this position, because ostensibly it's true. Yeah, climate always changes. There are natural drivers of climate change that cause it to go up and down in every which way. But that doesn't mean we don't know why and how it changed in the past, and that we can't compare the modern scenario with past scenarios. That's what we do in paleoclimatology all the time. And the fact that we do understand relatively well how climate has changed over the last few thousands of years, even the last few millions of years, that is the foundation for understanding how extreme the modern scenario is. We understand how extreme it is. We understand the main drivers of modern climate change, and that we actually do have a very big influence on that. So it's a very naive position, and it's extremely irresponsible at the same time, especially for anyone with an interest in politics. Because these do have negative impacts on society and on the economy. If all you care about is money, for example, that would be one strong deciding factor in taking this seriously, because it does result in major economic losses, even in highly buffered developed countries like the U.S., right? And more so if you have less stable economies, which we've seen in other parts of the world where things just they went to hell really quickly. And climate change was it tended to be that catalyst that drove existing instabilities. So it's very scary when you look at these examples, and that alone should cause us to act. But we can go beyond that too, and not just our financial well-being, but in terms of health. Health and welfare of human individuals, and also the rest of the natural world.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about it's proven that mankind is the one that's causing all this change and the rise in temperature. But I guess that you could scientifically say which industry causes the most influence in global warming, I guess. So it would probably be oil companies, right?
I wouldn't pin it directly on the oil companies. We can certainly have the discussion that I'm not an expert in, but certainly could have the discussion on to what extent oil companies knew what the main drivers of modern warming were, and to what extent they funded misinformation campaigns, and that's all there, and it's worth looking into. But at the same time, like the oil companies survive because we, the consumers, you keep it in demand, right? So you can't put all the blame on them, when we're the ones creating this demand and we're creating the opportunity for them to make lots of money. So I mean that's why the responsibility kind of goes back to everyone and personal choices and also how we're going to act individually, but also how we as a society are going to act and shift things. If you're talking about the major contributors to say changes in the atmosphere, then energy production is by far the biggest contribution. And beyond that, it's probably transportation and then agriculture, right? So if we could change only one thing, the biggest change we could make would be to our energy grids, right? And again, there's a political and economic question as to how practical that is, how much change we can do, what technologies are feasible and which ones are not. And I'm going to set aside that discussion here, and just because I'm not the expert on technologies and economic solutions and such, but I mean, the fact is, if there's one change that we can make, then that would have the biggest impact. Uh, second to that would be transportation, right? So it's not just planes, trains, and automobiles, but shipping and so forth. Any change that we make, any change to reduce that, though, gets compounded throughout the future. So, I mean, even if all we could do feasibly right now would be to switch to electric cars or something like that, then it would have a major reduction. It doesn't eliminate greenhouse gas outputs from transportation, but it has an impact, and that impact gets compounded throughout the future, just like interest gets compounded throughout the future. Um, Beyond that, it's agriculture, and that's not just farming vegetables and such, but also animal agriculture. I mean, if you break that down, you find that in terms of animal agriculture, that beef is the biggest contributor. After which you got pork and then a few other meats. So, if there's one change that you can make, then cut out beef, for example. Uh, but a lot of these, you can start to see that it's a very difficult challenge to overcome because we can't just stop eating. We can't just stop going places. We can't just turn off all the lights and turn off everything that needs energy. So it takes time, and no matter what decision we make, no matter what changes we make, there are people that will benefit and there are people that will be highly inconvenienced and some people that will lose everything, right? And that's why I said at the beginning that climate change it's not something that should be controversial because scientifically it's quite straightforward. But it is understandably controversial because any proposed solution is going to be at best a minor inconvenience and at worst like responsible for losing everything you worked for. There are some people that stand to lose a lot of money if we make simple changes to the energy grid for transportation and so forth. So that's what makes it controversial. That's what makes public opinion become divided, because everyone who has a stake in keeping the status quo will ensure that as many people are on their side as possible. So that's kind of the origin of these misinformation campaigns. They will take the scientific discussion and obfuscate it, make it look like we're all still debating whether or not this is really happening, when that's not the case at all. Then they'll make statements like, well, climate has always changed and it could be other natural factors, when we know that's not relevant or it's not true. So by inserting those obfuscations into the public discussion, they can easily divide public opinion. And like as I mentioned, in the United States, just as an example, fairly close until after 2007. And then the opinion sort of associates believing in global warming and wanting to take action with it on it. They associated that with the Democratic Party. So if you didn't like Democrats, then you already had motivation to be skeptical of climate change, and vice versa. So this started to divide the political opinions, divide public difficult to follow the order of reasoning that I mentioned first, go to the political question. We should be going through that all together. And when we get to a point of disagreement, then that's fine. We disagree and we talk about it. But people are approaching it from all different ways, and that's what's made it near impossible to maintain rational discussions on it. And the simple reason is that, like I said, any action we take will inconvenience somebody, and if that somebody has a lot of money, then they're going to make sure that you are on their side if they can.
I've watched a lot of YouTube videos about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and and all this stuff. Like, for example, their work on renewable energy, like in terms of solar, or their work on the Tesla company, that, and especially on changing all the truck industry into more on using electricity in order for fuel. That's a huge game changer, I guess, but it would have to take a very long time for that to actually be implemented.
Yeah, it can, and this gets back to the political discussion, because we can influence those transitions to some extent by creating economic incentives, right? I mean, if you offer tax breaks to do one thing, or something like that. I mean, for example, I mentioned I'm living in China, and it's not, I mean, people don't own cars to the same extent in China as they do in the US. I mean, it would be a mess if they did. But when they go to buy a new car, if you're looking in the US, electric cars in general have a higher sticker price up front. So you're going to pay more money up front. You're going to pay less money to maintain it, and maybe you'll save money down the road. But the fact that you're paying more up front means they're less accessible to most consumers. If you go to China, that's not the case. Not only is it cheaper up front to get the electric car, but you get the tax breaks and you don't have restrictions. I mean, normally if you buy a vehicle in China, you're not allowed to drive it at least 2 days of the week, period. If you have an electric car, you have no restrictions, right? So there's a huge economic incentive for the average consumer to buy those cars in China, and that's why that transition is happening a lot faster in China than in the US and many other countries. So we can add incentives here, but again, like if we propose that, some people are going to lose money. Others will gain money, and maybe a society as a whole is going to gain money. We're going to be better off, both in terms of, economically, in terms of pollution and public health, and I mean, there are many reasons from a utilitarian perspective to make this transition as fast as possible. But as long as somebody's being inconvenienced and they have any political influence at all, they're going to take full advantage, and that's kind of what's happening here. So it's very difficult, but it's something that we can try to accelerate if everyone's on the same page. I mean, you can't. I don't think it'll take as long of a time as many people expect, because you can look historically at how fast prices are falling. I mean, what seems kind of impossible now may not seem that way 5 years from now. And 5 years from now, we're going to look back and say, well, that really happened fast. I mean, you can look at almost any other innovation, like, looking at smartphones and just how fast it was that we went from them being, the rich person's plaything to being absolutely necessary for every teenage kid, So it's, I wouldn't call it impossible, but we just have to be wary of our collective control over, how fast those changes can happen. At the same time, it's worth pointing out, though, like, and this is this is what causes a lot of confusion in the discussion too. If you take something like an electric car, it doesn't have zero emissions. I mean, it does, while you're driving it, have near zero emissions, but it does cost something in terms of carbon emissions to construct the car and to mine the basic materials and things like that. So we are reducing the impacts on the climate by switching to electric cars, but not eliminating it entirely. So what people have done, and especially in these misinformation campaigns, a great example would be a PragerU video. Some people will be familiar with that service. And PragerU put out a video arguing that electric cars really aren't greener, and they don't really save the environment, they don't save carbon emissions, etc. And it was totally bogus if you pick it apart. If you go back to the sources and look at the papers they try to cite, and it's quite messy. But regardless, it's one of the ways in which people divide in public opinions. I mean, if they think that the difference that they can make personally, and it's not going to affect their wallet, then they're going to be more inclined to make that decision. Apart from uh, regardless of politics or anything like that. But when they don't believe that it makes a big difference, then they don't make these decisions quite as readily. So it's been quite a challenge here compared to many other places.
And I wanted to ask you one last question. Jonathan, it's been a great conversation. And what advice would you give to someone who's interested in their own personal, I guess, footprint, eco footprint, and in order for them to look for more reliable information and to make better decisions?
As far as, I mean, personal impacts, personal behaviors, uh, there are lots of little things that we can do. Uh, I mean, the biggest thing you can do is just reduce your energy impact. And to do that, take a look around the world. I mean, most of the world doesn't use the same amount of energy that the average American does, or average European, and so forth, and they get along just fine. And it's quite absurd just how much we use. And anything you can do to reduce that personal energy impact will have, I mean, that's one of the biggest changes you could make personally. Dietary changes, of course, have an influence, not as big, but they will have some influence. Can consider our consumer habits, our energy habits, and what I just finished talking about, the transportation habits as well. But I mean, really, it's something that's such a large-scale problem that it will have to involve large-scale action, and that means government action. That's what makes most people feel uncomfortable. A lot of people, and understandably so, don't trust the government to act responsibly, even if they're doing the right thing. They expect them to do it wrong. But we have to face the fact that we have to act collectively, and that means changing tax structures to provide economic incentives. It may mean adding regulations to industries, or it may mean calling off resource exploration of resources that we can't feasibly use. Like at this point, if we just used up all the oil and gas we've already found, I mean, the climatic impact is going to go way beyond our climate targets, right? The warming will far exceed what we think is the reasonable cutoff for that. And, so in addition to trying to change our individual patterns and behaviors, I mean, it's worth trying to influence how we as a society tackle this question. And that doesn't mean you have to switch political parties. I mean, if your political party leaders are those who say we need to act on climate change right now, then put pressure on them to actually do it, And if your political leaders are ones who say we should ignore it, we shouldn't care about it, then put pressure on them to shut up and stop pretending that it isn't real, because they're smart enough to know that it is an issue. And what they're saying publicly often doesn't reflect their personal opinion on the matter. So it can be very frustrating. So I mean, it's important. If somebody suggests step back and think, like, what's more likely? Is it that I've stumbled across something that no expert in the world understands or do, right? I mean, so if you have people spending decades researching this very specific topic, then probably they've thought of those skeptical reports to offer like a very obvious refutation of climate science, or some effort between hundreds of scientists and actually thousands of researchers all put together. That's important because, I mean, if you're only looking at what researchers say in one part of the world, in one country, one demographic, then maybe you have people from all around the world, from every country, different economies, different politics, and different religious backgrounds, all saying the same thing, and contributing to a report like this. Then you can trust that most of those biases have been filtered out depending on your background in science. The main websites I would recommend are Skeptical Science, especially if you're somebody who's if you're not a scientist yourself. If you are, and you have these are discussions by the people who research this most actively. Told panel on climate change reports by policy more than just we can set up the discussion and take the questions and talk about it. And if you feel like you've stumbled across some obvious refuge, no, at this time I just encourage people to step back, especially to what I said before, like keep the questions separate. And there is a scientific question, a moral question, and a political question here, and consider how to go through that reasoning in the right direction, right? If people object to the proposed political solution, that's fine. That's understandable, and everyone can think differently about that. But it's not justifiable reason to be skeptical of the science. And within the research community, there is an ongoing debate as to whether climatic change is happening, whether it's in the direction of warming, and whether human activity is the main driver of that. It's like we know it is, and it's fairly easy to demonstrate. So, as far as the scientific question, that's much more established than the public opinion would have you believe. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And bro, I've learned so much from you, and I hope that we could continue on with more episodes. Maybe I could have someone who doesn't believe in climate change talk to you.
Yeah, anytime.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
We're moving in a new direction, moving forward and moving beyond smoking. We are Altria, and our companies are leading the way in moving adult smokers away from cigarettes by taking action to transition millions toward potentially less harmful choices as we move from being known as a tobacco company to being recognized as a tobacco harm reduction company. Altria is moving beyond smoking. Find out how at altria.com.
It takes a lot of ingredients to fix or build a car, like cooking, but without the frozen dinner easy way out. eBay Motors has 122 million parts. It's always the right fitment, so you can follow any recipe to a T. Whether it's a vintage Italian coupe that's classic like Grandma's meatballs, or a German luxury car that's as complicated as Oma's rouladen, to cook up something great in the garage, use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.